In the dim corridor of a crumbling keep, a figure crouches in the shadow of a torch's flickering light, fingers curled around a dagger so rusted it groans with age. His heart is a thunderclap in his ribs, and outside, a dog is barking loud, angry, and certain. This isn't a game. This isn't sleek black leather and a well-timed leap from a rooftop. This is the 13th century, and being an assassin is not an art. It's a curse. Imagine trying to vanish in a town where everyone knows everyone. A village where a stranger's boots are enough to summon suspicion, where the local priest is also the town's only literate man, and gossip travels faster than pigeons. Imagine creeping through alleys so narrow they might crush you if you dared draw a breath. And imagine all this in a time before silence was even invented, because everything squeaked. Your shoes, your belt, your joints from malnutrition. And let's not even get started on the rats. They watched you work. Being a medieval assassin was never about elegance. It wasn't quiet, it wasn't clean, and it most certainly wasn't safe. If anything, it was a spectacularly bad career choice, unless you enjoyed being chased, burned, tortured, and disavowed by absolutely everyone who ever shook your hand. Let's go back. No, not to Florence or Venice or the poetic fictions of Renaissance intrigue. Further, to the dry hills of the Levant, late 11th century, where a real group known as the Hashishin, yes, the word that gave us assassin, began their bloody climb into legend. They were led by Hassan I Sabah, a man who made paranoia into a holy doctrine. His fortress, Alamut, perched high in the Persian mountains, was less a home and more a sermon made of stone. He trained his followers not in the art of killing but in the art of surrender, of abandoning fear, identity, even will. To be a Hashishin was to become death's tool, wielded not for justice or revenge, but cold purpose. And they were frighteningly good at it. They killed with daggers, never from afar. Poison was a coward's tool. A true assassin looked his target in the eye. But that closeness, that intimacy, came with a price. A single mistake, slip, hesitation, or misjudged timing meant capture. And capture never meant mercy. You see, torture in the medieval world was not a means to an end. It was the end. For an assassin, failure meant being slowly unmade, limb by limb, idea by idea. Not just killed, but unremembered, your name erased, your motives twisted by your enemies. Those who survived long enough to speak were often executed again, in stories, remade into madmen, heretics, demons. And yet, the Hashishin endured for nearly 2 centuries. Their greatest weapon wasn't steel, it was fear. Not fear of death, but of inevitability. Their targets, often kings or generals, were made to believe that they were already dead. The terror lay not in knowing if an assassin was coming, but when. One of the most famous stories tells of Sultan Saladin planning a campaign against their fortress. One morning, he woke to find a dagger planted beside his bed. No doors had been forced.
No guards harmed.
Just a dagger and a note. The campaign was quietly cancelled. But the Hashishin weren't the only players in this grim profession. Europe had its own version, less elegant, more clumsy, and far more desperate. These were men employed by feuding barons, bribed monks, even vengeful peasants. They had no creeds, no brotherhoods. They had greed. And greed, unlike loyalty, rarely survives crossbows. They dressed like merchants or monks. They walked for weeks to reach a target, often on foot because horses were loud and eyes noticed riders. They ate what they could steal. They slept with their backs to cold stone and their knives on their chests. And if they reached their target, they had one chance, one to succeed. There were no second tries. If the blow missed, if the Lord's guard turned too quickly, if a loose cobblestone betrayed a footstep, death wasn't slow. It was immediate. A sword through the gut, a club to the skull. Sometimes they weren't even killed by the guards, but by the mob. Crowds loved a public kill. It was rare entertainment, and should an assassin escape, it didn't matter. Their client often vanished or refused payment. "I never asked him to do it," they'd say. "I barely know the man, so how did such miserable souls persist?" Why take the job? Because it was the job. In a world where most people died knowing no one beyond their village, where upward mobility was a cruel joke, assassination offered something else. Agency. The farmer could become history. peasant could strike a king, and sometimes it even worked. Take the bizarre tale of James of Douglas, a Scottish knight and follower of Robert the Bruce. After the king's death, Bruce asked that his heart be taken to the Holy Land, a final pilgrimage. James carried it in a silver casket. He never reached Jerusalem. Instead, he ended up fighting the Moors in Spain, throwing the king's heart into battle with a cry, "Lead on, brave heart, I'll follow thee." It was suicide, but it was beautiful, tragic, revered. The heart was recovered. James was not. Then there's the strange case of the papal poisoner. In the 14th century, rumors swirled about a shadowy figure known only as Il Tincture, said to be employed by rival factions within the church itself. He specialized in slow-acting toxins, arsenic laced with honey, venom stirred into wine, and his victims died praising God. No proof he existed, of course, but the cardinals whispered, and the whispering was enough. The church, by the way, had its own killers, just never officially. There were inquisitors who found heretics already dead. Sometimes suicides, sometimes accidents. Sometimes the Inquisition discovered evidence before they'd even questioned the accused.
Convenient, no?
Of course, it wasn't only men who played the game. There were women too, often overlooked, often underestimated, which, as it turns out, made them perfect. Courtesans, widows, handmaidens. They were invisible, and invisible things can kill without being seen. One famous case is that of Tofana di Adamo, later known as Julia Tofana. She sold makeup laced with arsenic to women who wished to become widows. Her concoction was colorless, tasteless, and deadly over time. They called it aqua tofana. She claimed over 600 victims, not through daggers but droplets. Her customers loved her. So did their husbands, until they didn't. Eventually, she was caught, tortured, and executed. But her legend lingers, a spectral assassin wearing powder and perfume. And through all this, the centuries of blood and betrayal, of poison and knives and silver hearts thrown into battle, one truth remains. There was nothing romantic about it. Assassins died broke. They died alone. They died hated, feared, or erased. There were no statues for them, no songs, only stories, half remembered and half lies, because history forgets the knife that struck and remembers only the king who fell. But while they lived, while they crouched in alleys or watched from rooftops, while they crossed deserts with nothing but a blade and a name, they mattered. Not because they were good or noble or even clever, but because they forced the powerful to look over their shoulders. And that was worth something. Now let's take a moment. Picture the assassin again. Not the myth, not the leaping shadow, the real one. Thin, tired, probably cold, hands cracked, breath misting in the dark. He has no gods, no allies, only a target. He wonders just for a moment if it's worth it. Then the door creaks open. A man steps through, the dagger rises, and history holds its breath. The next tale, perhaps more absurd than tragic, comes to us from the Kingdom of Hungary in the 15th century. An age of crowns too heavy for the heads that wore them, and courts filled with secrets, servants, and a faint, constant scent of blood. King Matthias Corvinus ruled with cunning and a taste for spectacle, but he had enemies, not just from the Ottomans at the borders, but from within his own noble circles. The assassin in this case was a failed actor turned spy, known only in records as Istvan the Pale. He wasn't pale due to complexion. He was pale from chronic fear, a man who shook with such consistency that his enemies assumed he had palsy. But he was clever. His greatest success. He never actually killed anyone. Istvan's method was rumor. He forged letters, dropped false evidence, and convinced paranoid lords that someone was plotting to murder them. Chaos followed like clockwork. Noblemen turned on each other, swords were drawn, alliances shattered. Dozens of executions were carried out by the accused themselves. And through it all, Istvan lived in a damp room above a tavern, laughing into his wine. It wasn't until he forged a letter implicating himself, by mistake, that he was caught. They say he died smiling, hung upside down over the palace gates, more noticed in death than he ever was in life. If the medieval assassin had a motto, it wouldn't be honor or vengeance or even devotion. It would be, Make it count because you won't get another chance. But now we drift further west to England, to the year 1381, a year so soaked in rebellion and chaos that even the king, young Richard II, was almost killed in the open streets. The peasants' revolt, sparked by rising taxes and long-simmering fury, saw an odd cast of characters rise from obscurity. One such figure, John Ball, a priest with a tongue like fire and a heart full of knives. Though not an assassin by trade, his sermons incited men to kill, sometimes themselves, often each other. One of Ball's followers, an ex-miller named Cottrell the Red, took the role of executioner of tyrants. With nothing but a hatchet and a hood, he snuck into manors at night, beheaded local tax collectors, and vanished before dawn. Some say he left poems behind, others just bloody symbols carved into walls. His end came when a farmer betrayed him for a pardon. Cottrell died with his hatchet still clenched in his hand. And so it goes. Assassination was rarely about the kill itself. It was about timing, about chaos, about what happens after the dagger lands. Consider the Byzantine Empire, a palace built on silk, marble, and venom. Court intrigue in Constantinople was an Olympic sport, and no empire gave rise to as many quiet deaths behind closed doors. One empress, Theodora, allegedly kept a chamber of eunuchs trained in strangulation.
No wounds. No screams.
Just silence. Rivals didn't just disappear, they were rewritten. Stripped of titles, erased from murals, their statues melted down and recast as saints or lions. You could be a hero one day and not even a ghost the next. But what about failed assassins? Their stories are often the most compelling and the most tragic. Take Bertrand of Gascogny. Poor Bertrand. He was promised a land grant, a title, and the hand of a baron's daughter if he could kill a minor noble aligned with the French crown. Bertrand snuck into the estate disguised as a lute player. He actually learned to play just for the cover. On the night of the deed, he managed to poison the noble's wine, only to accidentally swap goblets during a toast. Bertrand died mid-song, face first into the strings of his own disguise. The baron never even knew an assassin had come. And there's still more. In Japan, while not strictly medieval Europe, the shinobi, often romanticized as ninjas, lived lives not dissimilar to our European friends in misfortune. Early records show they weren't shadowy killers in black garb, but desperate mercenaries, farmers recruited in secret, using tools like sickles, blow darts, and firecrackers. They were often deployed to sabotage, not kill, to create fear. Sometimes the best assassination wasn't one that took a life, but one that made a man live in fear of losing it. The Tokugawa shogunate grew so afraid of these whispered ghosts that entire city plans were designed to detect intruders. Curved walkways to prevent straight-line escape, gravel paths that crunched too loudly to walk in silence, doors that sang like birds when opened. Still, the assassins came, and sometimes they left. Back in Europe, across France and the Holy Roman Empire, poison became the art of choice. Easier to deny, easier to blame on food, disease, or fate. Apothecaries became artists of death, some even with catalogs, coded, of course. Powder of St. Martha for heart convulsions. Draught of Lazarus for sleep without waking. Smoke of Cain for madness before death. Then there was the book. No one knows who wrote it. Found centuries later in a burned monastery near Aachen. Its Latin title loosely translates to On the Quiet End of Men. It lists recipes, strategies, and bizarre rituals, like painting your eyelids with vinegar and goat's blood to see lies, or carrying a worm in your boot to avoid detection. Absurd? Possibly. But many of the book's pages were torn out, likely by monks who read them too closely. Now, let us return again to the human cost. Not the blood, there was always blood, but the isolation. Assassins had no comrades, no family. The closer they got to a successful kill, the farther they drifted from the world. They could never stay, never return. The moment the blade did its work, they ceased to be men. They became fugitives. Imagine that. You kill a tyrant. The people cheer. The banners fall. But you run. You hide. If you're caught, you're not a hero. You're a criminal. The man you killed is remembered as complicated. You are remembered as nothing. Some did try to justify their actions, wrote letters, confessions, but paper burns and kings rewrite history, and so the medieval assassin did not walk into legend. He tripped into it, bleeding, half-starved, forgotten, crawling through mud and whispers. Still, we are fascinated by them. We play their stories. We wear their cloaks in games, read their legends in novels. Why? Because they were powerless men and women who took power, terribly, briefly, fatally. Because their stories, when whispered in the right ear, still make hearts beat faster. And maybe, just maybe, because part of us wants to believe that one dagger, held with purpose, could still change the world. We will continue. But let this moment rest, like dust on a forgotten blade. The night is long, the past longer, and there are still thousands of steps to take through the graveyards of those who killed in darkness and died in silence. Then we descend deeper, into darker corners and stranger shadows. For every blade that struck its mark, a dozen more clattered to the ground, poisoned by hesitation, panic, or the sheer chaos of a world where killing a man was easy but escaping the consequences was not. Let us now cross into the winding alleys of Moorish Spain, where cultures clashed not only in battlefields but in ideas, sciences, and yes, murder. In the courts of Al-Andalus, where poets and philosophers mingled with viziers and spies, the line between scholar and killer was often as thin as a reed. Here, assassination was not always the task of a lone man skulking through shadows, but a science, refined by bureaucrats with pens dipped in venom, not ink. One story tells of a philosopher named Tariq al-Makari, a man so revered for his wit and insight that emirs competed for his company. What few knew was that Tariq also worked as a cleansing agent for the ruling caliph, paid to eliminate dissenters under the guise of academic debates. He would invite targets to salons, challenge their beliefs, expose their heresies, and then disappear for a few days. His victims were found dead, not stabbed or poisoned, but publicly disgraced. Their reputations dismantled so thoroughly that their supporters abandoned them before the blade was needed. They hung themselves, they fled, or, occasionally, the caliph's guards simply cleaned up what Tariq had already killed, the soul. Now travel north into the lands of the Teutonic Order, whose silent warriors were anything but saints. These knights marched beneath the cross but carried out assassinations in the name of purity, conquest, and control. One such knight, Dieter von Clausen, earned the name the Silent Wolf. His method? Ambushing lone tribal leaders on the pretext of negotiation. He'd sit with them, share bread, pray together, and then drive a narrow blade beneath the ribs, always under the left arm. He claimed that's where fear lived. The order denied his existence, but records of sudden leadership voids, sealed letters, and strange disappearances follow his path like footprints in ash. Then there were the Venetians, Venice soaked in art, fog, and conspiracy. Here, murder was a formal affair. The Council of Ten, Venice's secret ruling body, made liberal use of what they called the Black Ledger. Inside were names of troublemakers, smugglers, rival merchants. When a name entered that book, the person usually exited life. The killers were bravi, hired blades who never spoke of their work and often never survived long after it. Payment was generous, but brief. Bravi weren't allowed to live wealthy enough to tell stories. One infamous bravo, known only as Silvio della Notte, became legend for a killing so perfect it passed into myth. He allegedly murdered 3 French envoys in the Doge's palace in a single night, none of whom were found until the next morning, sitting upright, eyes open, each with a small coin in their mouth. The meaning? Unclear. Some say it was payment for silence. Others, a curse. Silvio was never caught. But months later, a man with no tongue was pulled from the Grand Canal with a letter tied to his wrist. The letter bore one phrase, "I do not sleep, I watch." But not every assassin was so refined. Some were accidental, born not into orders or guilds but into desperation. Consider the tale of Isolde, a washerwoman from rural Bavaria. Her husband, pressed into military service, never returned. The local baron took her land, her goat, even her roof. Isolde didn't cry. She took a kitchen knife and waited until the baron's hunting party passed through the woods. She stepped onto the path, pretending to beg. When he looked away, she cut his throat and kept walking. She was never caught. A folk song bearing her name survived in 2 dialects before being banned by the church. Her legend flickers on, faceless, voiceless, a woman who killed a lord and simply vanished. But what of the conspiracies? The attempts that almost changed history. There was the wine cellar plot of 1473 in Bohemia, where a group of bakers and butchers planned to kill King Vladislaus II by digging a tunnel beneath the castle and collapsing it during a feast. The plan was ridiculous. The tunnel flooded, one conspirator died of wine poisoning, and another confessed everything to a prostitute, who told the guard, who told the king. The plotters were hanged upside down in the town square, each with a loaf of bread stuffed in his mouth. Then we have Magister Lupus, a monk-turned-alchemist in the Holy Roman Empire, who attempted to assassinate a bishop using a mechanical bird rigged to release powder into wine. The bird worked. The powder did not. The bishop drank 3 goblets, fell asleep, and awoke refreshed. Lupus was flayed alive. His notes, however, went missing from the monastery library. Some say they surfaced again in Prague. Others in the Vatican. And what of the guilds? Yes, there were assassination guilds, though rarely under that name. They disguised themselves as mercenary groups, fraternal orders, or even traveling performers. One such group, the Vesperus Blades, operated in the Balkans and were rumored to train children from age 7 to be soul stealers. They were not permitted to speak, only listen. Their training involved mimicking birds, walking without sound, and smiling while lying. Their existence is debated. The only written mention comes from a Moldovan merchant's diary, who claimed he saw a boy slit a tax collector's throat and vanish into a crowd like smoke. No one believed him. He was found dead 3 days later with a paper duff stuffed in his mouth. Let us not forget Russia, where the snow did not mute death. It celebrated it. The 16th century was the era of Ivan the Terrible, and with him came the Oprichniki, his private guard, part military, part death cult. They wore black robes, rode black horses, and carried severed dogs' heads on their saddles as symbols of vigilance. They assassinated lords, generals, even monks, often in public as warnings. But among them was one named Alexei Smertnikov who broke the code. He began killing without orders, choosing victims who spoke too loudly or walked like traitors. Eventually, Ivan himself ordered Alexei's death. He was found drowned in a barrel of his own blood. Or so the story goes. And always, behind these tales lies the same pattern. The assassin is feared, then used, then discarded. They are never allowed to become powerful. That is their tragedy, and their power, because though history crushes most underfoot, the assassin is the thorn it cannot forget. The itch in the skin of empire. The unblinking eye in the back of every ruler's mind. As we continue this journey, hour by hour, shadow by shadow, we will meet more. The laughing killer of Sicily who danced before each kill. The Welsh twins who made a game of poisoning clergy. The silent monk from Norway who chiseled heretics' names into his own bones. The night is not over. Then open the next page with blood-stained fingers and steady breath. For now we plunge into stories buried so deeply in time that only whispers and bones remain to speak for them. The laughing killer of Sicily, his real name lost, his legend unkillable, was known only as Il Sorridente, the Smiling One. He appeared during the 12th century, when Norman control over Sicily was cracking under pressure from Muslim rebels, rogue knights, and Byzantine schemers. Il Sorridente struck with precision and cruelty, not out of political conviction but pure mockery. His trademark was laughter, high, joyous, unhinged, heard seconds before the blade, sometimes after. He carved jokes into his victims' bodies. What walks on 2 legs in the morning and none by night? One corpse bore across the chest. Another had the words, "Ask your God to explain this." The church branded him a demon. Locals thought him a jester gone mad. But a hidden report from a Dominican friar, now locked in the Vatican archives, claims Il Sorridente was once a court poet whose family was executed after refusing to convert. His mind snapped, and the laughter never left. He was never caught, though a mask, porcelain white, cracked with a painted grin, was found nailed to the door of a noble's estate days after a massacre. Some say that was his final bow. But even madness was not the assassin's greatest weapon. Timing was. The Welsh twins, Ellen and Merton ap Glyn, knew this well. In 1282, during Edward I's conquest of Wales, the siblings used poison to resist the English crown. They were not warriors. They were brewers. Their monastery near Llangollen produced a dark, bitter ale beloved by local priests. When English clergy began taking over, Ellen adjusted the brew. Nightshade, aconite, hemlock. Slowly, one by one, priests began falling ill during Mass. 13 dead in under 2 years. Merton kept records in coded margins of prayer books. Ellen sang while she stirred the cauldron. When they were caught, it was not by English authorities but by a jealous monk. They were burned. Not together but back to back, so they would never conspire again. Still, locals say that every 7th year, the river by their monastery runs bitter and black, and no crops grow for a day. Curse. Or perhaps just memory refusing to die. And what of Brother Håkon, the Norwegian monk with the chisel? He lived in a remote monastery above the Sonefjord, a place of snow, silence, and scripture. But Brother Håkon kept no Bible. He carried instead a knife and a bone chisel. His mission was divine, he claimed. He etched the names of heretics, dead or alive, into the flesh of his own torso, believing it was his sacred burden to carry their sins unto God. But some of the names weren't just heretics. They were bishops, nobles, even fellow monks. One winter, a visitor, a papal envoy, went missing.
No witnesses.
No evidence. But when Håkon was discovered dead years later, half frozen in his cell, the name of that envoy was freshly carved into his thigh. An inquisition followed. His monastery was abandoned. Yet carvings in the stone crypt remain. One line, untranslated for centuries, reads, "I was the silence behind every scream." So we ask again, why? Why do these figures, half lost in the fog of history, cling so tightly to our imagination? Why do we remember them, the invisible, the cursed, the condemned? Because even in anonymity, the assassin leaves a mark. Not just on flesh, but on time itself. They shape the flow of power. When a king dies, a kingdom falters. When a bishop falls, faith shudders. When a merchant is removed, the entire balance of trade can shift. Sometimes one blade tips history. Take the conspiracy of the Starless Court in the fractured principalities of 15th century Germany. A plot so complex it reads like a fever dream, but every piece is documented in the fragmented diaries of Duke Ulrich von Schwaben. The Starless Court wasn't a court at all. It was a network of disenfranchised nobles, bastard sons, and dispossessed knights who believed that assassinating every elector of the Holy Roman Empire within 1 year would collapse the entire system. Madness. But they tried. In 1476, 6 electors died. 1 drowned, 2 stabbed, 1 poisoned, 1 hanged by his own lute strings, and 1 whose heart exploded during a sermon. The 7th, Count Palatine Friedrich, faked his own death and lived under an assumed name in Prague for 2 years. When he reappeared, he declared the conspiracy ended and blamed foreign heretics. The remaining members of the Starless Court were hunted down, flayed, and their skins turned into book covers. Yet those books, bound in human leather, still exist in private collections. Now let us pivot, because not all assassins killed for gold or vengeance. Some killed for art. Consider the Feast of Thorns, a ritual performed only once in Florence, 1491. The artist was Giacomo Bellari, a famed sculptor. He believed that death revealed the true form of the soul and sought to sculpt a moment of perfect expression. He arranged for a dinner party of 7 corrupt bankers, all of whom had defrauded the city, exiled rivals, and bribed clergy. He cooked the meal himself, laced it with a slow toxin derived from crushed lilies and honey fungus. Each guest died in the middle of a laugh. Bellari was found calmly sketching their final poses, brush wet with wine. He was executed by hanging, but his final sculpture, L'ultima risata, the last laugh, is housed in a vault beneath the Uffizi Gallery, hidden. Too disturbing, some say, for public viewing. There's more. So much more. The tanners of Thessaloniki who killed only on Sundays. The clockmaker of Dijon, who built a device that poisoned with every tick. The nameless mother, who taught orphans to kill for coins, but buried them when they cried after. The 14 Veils of Baghdad, women who used perfumes laced with mercury to seduce, then kill, governors under Mongol rule. Each one a ghost in history. Each one a line unspoken in the official version. And yet, they endured, because the assassin is not a warrior, not a soldier. They are not bound by rules or mercy. They are the echo beneath history's anthem, the black notes between the chords of empire. They are what kings fear when they lock their doors. They are what makes history jump. Then let us continue, as the shadows lengthen, and time bends like a candle's flicker in a drafty monastery. We trace the ever-darkening spine of history's forgotten killers. We go now to Song Dynasty China, where the imperial courts glittered with jade and gold, and death dressed as an art form. There existed a sect known only by its whispered name, the Blood Musicians. Their origins are murky. Some claim they descended from court performers exiled during the reign of Emperor Ranzong. Others that they were slaves of war trained in both music and silent death. What remains consistent is their method. They arrived in towns under the guise of traveling theater troupes. Gongs, flutes, stringed pipa. When they performed, crowds gathered. Their operas told stories of loyalty, betrayal, dynasties long buried in dust. But the end of every performance came with a death. The target was chosen days before. Corrupt magistrate, a cruel landowner, a gluttonous general. And during the crescendo, while the audience wept or cheered, one of the musicians would strike. Poisoned hairpin, a flute whose reed delivered venom, a note so high it masked a scream. The bodies were always found after. The killer never was. One blood musician, remembered in record only as Li the Silent Tone, became infamous after a performance at the Summer Palace in 1049. The Empress Dowager herself attended. The show was The Fox and the Emperor's Mirror. When it ended, 6 guards were dead, 1 chancellor had vanished, and the Empress's lapdog barked itself hoarse, only to die an hour later. Poisoned by incense, the performers were gone by dawn. Only the scent of jasmine remained. Now we travel further west, to the wreckage of Carpathian principalities, where nobility sat on splintering thrones and ruled over starving villages with iron teeth. In the early 15th century, a boy was born to a minor noble family, sickly, unwanted, and nearly drowned at birth by his midwife. His name was Toma of the Thorn, and he grew to be a man whose silence terrified entire regions. He didn't speak, not once, a mute, but he wrote. In perfect Latin, Toma wrote letters offering solutions to problems, always signed with the image of a rose bleeding from its stem. He killed for widows, for peasants, for vengeful lords. But not quickly, not cleanly. He left messages carved into the bones of his victims, letters folded into mouths, each addressed to someone else, always hinting that the victim had betrayed them. Toma never ran. He watched. He was captured once, tied to a tree during a thunderstorm, beaten until his bones cracked. He didn't scream. When lightning struck a nearby hill, the guards ran. In the morning, Toma was gone. In their place hung the men who'd tortured him, each strung by their own intestines, their eyes replaced by rose petals soaked in blood. He was never seen again. But the image of the bleeding rose began appearing in towns across Europe, graffitied on doors, carved into trees. No one knew if he was alive. That was the fear, the assassin who might never die. But if Toma was horror, let us look now at delicacy, for even death can come on silk feet. In Heian, Japan, before the shoguns, before the samurai became the monsters they feared becoming, there lived an assassin known as Yuki no Mei, Snow in Front. A noble woman cast out for dishonor. She vanished into the slums of Kyoto and returned as a creature of mirrors and poison. She used fans tipped with slow-kill venom, usually made of crushed white oleander, and dressed in white, always white, as though mourning herself. Her victims died days after meeting her. Always men of power, courtiers, poets, even a prince. Her weapon was conversation. She would flirt, discuss poetry, offer wine, touch a sleeve, smile. No violence.
No spectacle.
They would sleep and not rise again. One day, a monk found a collection of her victims' death poems, transcribed by her own hand. Each poem was perfect, each signed with the kanji for snow. When her identity was discovered, the emperor sent 30 men to seize her. They found her home empty, only a mirror in the center of the room. It was said if you looked into it, you would see the face of the last person you betrayed. The mirror is kept now in a box wrapped in black silk in a private vault in Kyoto. It is said no one dares open it. But if we linger too long on elegance, we forget the truth. Most assassinations were not masterpieces. They were chaos, slaughter, mistakes. Let us remember the night of salt and fire 1127 in the heart of Jerusalem during the chaos of the Crusades. A Syrian boy, only 14, paid by a Crusader commander to kill a rival knight. The boy hid in the latrine shaft, waited until the knight sat, then stabbed upward with a shard of iron. The knight survived. The boy did not. He was flayed, his skin nailed to the chapel door. A warning? Perhaps. But 2 weeks later, that same knight was poisoned by his own squire. No one ever found the poison, but the squire's journal was later discovered, written in Arabic. The boy, it seems, had paid him, promised him freedom. The squire killed the knight, then himself. That's the way it was. One blade failed. Another waited. Assassins were everywhere. And often they were not who anyone suspected. A blind beggar in Krakow who killed with a sharpened walking stick. A priest in Vienna who slit throats between sermons. A child in Portugal who claimed to see angels, until he led 2 men into the woods and buried a knife in each. A monk in Toledo who wrote sermons that, if read backwards, predicted who would die next. And now we approach the fiction that feels too close to truth. What if we wove it together? Imagine an assassin born from this tapestry, a character forged from real tales, but unbound by historical chains. Shall I begin their journey? A child born nameless, raised in a forgotten monastery that served not God, but the silence between prayers. A blade hidden in a book, a creed not written but whispered into the ear of the dying. A single rule: you exist only to correct history's mistakes. They walk across centuries, through Mongol siege, Ottoman rise,
Papale corruption.
French decadence, American Revolution,